I arrived at my son's apartment with 2 suitcases and nowhere else to go, only to find out he had moved out overnight, right after promising I could stay. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that changed everything I thought I knew about love, family, and sacrifice. What hurt most was not the silence, but the realization that it had all been planned. And what I discovered next would force me to choose between holding on or finally letting go. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 68 years old, and until recently, I believed I understood exactly what my life had become. I lived alone in a small coastal town in Maine, in a modest house that faced the Atlantic Ocean. The view was beautiful, especially at sunrise, when the sky turned pale gold and the water shimmered like something out of a painting. People often told me I was lucky to live in such a peaceful place. I used to agree with them. Now I'm not so sure. My days followed a quiet, predictable rhythm. I woke up early, usually before the sun rose, and made myself a cup of coffee. I would sit by the kitchen window, watching the tide roll in and out, listening to the distant cry of seagulls. After that, I would tidy the house, read a little, maybe take a short walk along the shore if the weather allowed. There was nothing wrong with this life. It was calm, stable, and free of chaos, but it was also empty in ways that are difficult to explain unless you have lived it. I had been a nurse for most of my adult life. It was not glamorous work, but it was meaningful. I spent years caring for others, often working long shifts, sometimes through the night. When my husband fell ill with heart disease, I left my job without hesitation. For 5 years, I became his full-time caregiver. Those were difficult years, but I never regretted them. He passed away quietly one winter morning, and after that, the house felt different, larger, somehow, quieter in a way that echoed. After he was gone, my world narrowed to one person, my son, Daniel Collins. He was my only child, the center of everything I had worked for and sacrificed. I raised him largely on my own, balancing work and motherhood as best as I could. There were nights I went without sleep, and days I went without proper meals, just to make sure he had what he needed. I never told him about those things. I did not want him to feel burdened by my choices. I believed that love, real love, was supposed to be given freely, without expectation. Daniel grew up, as children do. He left for college, then built a life for himself in Boston. He found a job in finance, married a woman named Emily, and settled into a world that felt very far from mine. At first, we spoke often, weekly calls, occasional visits, but over time, those calls became shorter. The visits became rare. There was always a reason: work deadlines, travel, obligations. I did not fully understand. I learned not to insist. I told myself this was normal. Children grow up. They become busy. They have their own lives. A mother must learn to step back. I repeated that thought so many times, it began to sound like truth. And yet, there were moments, especially in the quiet of the evening, when doubt crept in. I would sit alone in my living room, the television playing softly in the background, and wonder if Daniel ever thought of me when I was not the one reaching out first. I wondered if he remembered the small things, the sacrifices, the years I had poured into his life. More than anything, I wondered if I still mattered to him, or if I had become something distant, like a memory that fades over time. I was not angry. That is what I told myself. I was simply unsure, but sometimes uncertainty can weigh heavier than anger. And deep down, beneath all the routines and quiet acceptance, there was a question I could no longer ignore. If you're still watching and already feeling that quiet tension building, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move on to what changed everything. The question followed me into every corner of my day after that evening. It did not arrive loudly or all at once. It settled in slowly, like fog rolling in from the ocean, until everything felt dimmer, less certain. I kept telling myself that I was overthinking, that Daniel was simply busy, that this was what life looked like when children grew into adults. But the doubt would not leave. It lingered in the quiet moments, pressing gently but persistently against my thoughts. Then, one afternoon, everything shifted. I was in my kitchen, rinsing a coffee mug, when the phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, from a different state. I almost ignored it. I rarely received calls from numbers I did not recognize. But something made me answer. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. The man introduced himself as a lawyer based in California. At first, I thought it was a mistake. He asked if I was Margaret Collins, and when I confirmed, he explained that a distant cousin of mine had recently passed away. I struggled to remember her name. We had not spoken in decades. I had no reason to believe I would be involved in anything related to her estate. Then he told me something that did not make sense. She had named me as her sole beneficiary. I remember gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, feeling as though the room had shifted slightly out of place. He explained the details carefully, mentioning documents, accounts, and legal procedures. The number he eventually stated did not feel real. $7.2 million. It sounded like something meant for someone else, someone who lived a completely different kind of life. I did not react the way I imagined people would. There was no immediate joy, no sense of celebration. Instead, I felt disoriented. My entire life had been built around modest means, careful planning, and quiet sacrifices. I had spent years counting expenses, making sure every dollar had a purpose. Now I was being told that none of that mattered anymore. Over the next few days, I spoke with the lawyer again. He guided me through the process, explaining each step in a language that was patient but still unfamiliar. I signed documents, listened carefully, and tried to understand what this meant for me. By all accounts, it was legitimate. The money would soon be mine. But instead of imagining what I could do with it, my thoughts kept returning to one place: Daniel. I found myself wondering how he would react if he knew. Would he be surprised? Proud? Would it change anything between us? And then, without warning, another thought followed close behind, a more difficult one. What if I had nothing? The contrast struck me harder than the inheritance itself. I had never tested that question before. I had never needed to. I had always assumed that the bond between us was strong enough, that my role in his life still held meaning. But now, faced with this sudden shift in my circumstances, I realized I did not truly know. The idea made me uncomfortable. Testing my own son felt wrong, almost cruel. It went against everything I believed about trust and family. For days, I tried to push the thought away. I told myself it was unnecessary, that I should simply accept things as they were. But the doubt remained, and eventually, it grew stronger than my hesitation. I began to think through what I would say. I imagined a situation that felt believable: a failed investment, unexpected debt, the possibility of losing my home. It had to sound real, grounded in the kind of problems people actually faced. I rehearsed the words quietly to myself, adjusting them until they felt natural. The more I thought about it, the clearer one thing became. Living with uncertainty was more painful than facing the truth, whatever that truth might be. One evening, as the light faded outside my window, I picked up my phone. My hands were not steady. I stared at Daniel's name for a long moment before pressing the call button. The line rang several times. Each second stretched longer than it should have. Part of me hoped he would not answer, that I could put the decision off a little longer. But then I heard his voice. I took a breath, and I began to speak. If you're starting to sense that something isn't quite right beneath the surface, comment number 2 below to stay with me. Now let's see what really happened next. Daniel did not hesitate when I told him I had lost everything. His answer came quickly, almost too quickly, as if the words had been waiting just beneath the surface. He told me I could stay with him, that I should not worry, that everything would be fine. On the outside, it sounded exactly like what a son should say, but something in his tone felt rehearsed, smooth, in a way that did not match the gravity of what I had just told him. I tried not to think too much about it. Relief came first. Relief that he had said yes, that I would not be alone, that perhaps I had been wrong to doubt him. Still, that faint uneasiness lingered, quiet but persistent. I pushed it aside. I told myself I was letting fear distort something simple and kind. That evening, I began to pack. I did not take much, just a couple of suitcases with clothes, a few personal items, and some photographs I could not leave behind. Each object I placed inside felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. I was not just packing belongings. I was stepping away from a life I had known for decades. Every corner of that house held memories. Daniel as a child, running through the hallway. My husband sitting by the window, reading quietly. The echoes of a life that once felt full. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the faint creak of wood, the wind brushing against the windows. I kept imagining what it would be like to live in Daniel's world, to share space with him again, even temporarily. There was comfort in that thought, but also something fragile, as if it could break at any moment. I woke before sunrise and moved through the house slowly, almost ceremonially. I made coffee, but did not drink much of it. I stood in the doorway for a long time before leaving, taking one last look at everything. It felt like I was closing a chapter, though I could not yet understand what the next one would be. The trip to Boston was quiet. I watched the landscape change as I traveled, the open stretches of Maine giving way to denser roads and buildings. People moved around me, focused on their own lives, while I sat with my thoughts, trying to hold on to a sense of calm that felt increasingly uncertain. When I finally arrived at Daniel's building, I paused outside for a moment. It was exactly as I remembered, tall, modern, polished in a way that always made me feel slightly out of place. I adjusted my grip on my suitcase and walked inside. The lobby was quiet, clean, almost too perfect. I approached the front desk and gave Daniel's name, expecting to be directed upstairs. Instead, the receptionist looked at me with a polite but confused expression. He informed me that Daniel had moved out. At first, I thought I had misunderstood. I asked him to repeat it, and he did, calmly, as if it were a simple fact. Daniel had ended his lease the night before and left the building. There was no forwarding address on file. For a moment, I could not process what I was hearing. The words did not connect to anything real. I stood there, holding the handle of my suitcase, feeling as though the ground beneath me had shifted. I stepped aside and tried calling Daniel. Once, twice, 3 times. Each call went unanswered. I sent messages, short at first, then longer, asking where he was, asking what had happened. There was no reply. Slowly, the truth began to take shape. This had not been sudden. It had been planned. He had known I was coming. He had agreed to help me, and then, before I could arrive, he had disappeared. I walked back outside and stood on the sidewalk, surrounded by the movement of the city. Cars passed, people hurried by, conversations continued as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. I was not just turned away, I had been avoided. If you're starting to sense that something isn't quite right beneath the surface, comment number 2 below to stay with me. Now, let's see what really happened next. I stood outside Daniel's building longer than I should have, holding on to the handle of my suitcase as if it were the only thing keeping me steady. The city moved around me without pause, indifferent to what had just happened. For a moment, I felt suspended between 2 realities, the one I thought I was stepping into and the one that had just revealed itself without warning. But I did not break. Not there. Not in the middle of a sidewalk where no one knew my name. Instead, I turned back inside. The lobby felt colder the second time. I approached the front desk again, this time with the more intention. I asked if there was anyone else I could speak to, someone who might have more information. After a brief wait, a building manager came out, polite but cautious. I explained that I was Daniel's mother and that I had just arrived expecting to stay with him. The manager hesitated before answering. Then, in a careful tone, he confirmed what I already knew, but had not fully accepted. Daniel had terminated his lease early. He had paid a penalty to leave immediately. The paperwork had been processed the same evening I had called him. There was no misunderstanding. This had been planned. I thanked the manager and stepped away, my movements calm, almost mechanical. Inside, something had shifted. The confusion that had clouded my thoughts earlier began to settle into something clearer, sharper. Pain was still there, but it was no longer chaotic. It was focused. I left the building and found a taxi. I gave the driver the address of a small hotel not far from downtown. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere I could think without interruption. During the ride, I stared out the window, watching the city pass by in fragments. Traffic lights, storefronts, people crossing streets. Everything looked normal. Nothing reflected the weight I was beginning to feel. When I reached the hotel, I checked in quickly and went straight to my room. I set my suitcase by the door and sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment before doing anything else. My hands were steady now. That surprised me. I reached for my phone. There were still no messages from Daniel. Instead of calling again, I opened my banking application. It was something I had not thought about until that moment, but now it felt necessary. I began reviewing my recent financial activity, slowly at first, then with growing attention. At a glance, everything seemed ordinary. Routine transactions, small expenses, nothing out of place. Then I noticed it. A loan account I did not recognize. I opened the details, my heart beginning to beat harder, though my hands remained still. The amount was significant, far beyond anything I would have ever requested. The documents attached to the account showed a signature that looked like mine, but something about it felt wrong. Too precise in some places, too careless in others. I scrolled further. The funds had been withdrawn months ago, transferred into an investment account that had since been closed. The notes referenced losses, total losses. For a moment, I could not breathe properly, not because I did not understand what I was seeing, but because I understood it too well. Daniel had taken out a loan in my name. He had signed for me, and he had lost it. I sat there in silence, staring at the screen, letting the reality settle into place piece by piece. This was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act, one that required planning, access, and a willingness to cross a line that should never have been touched. The pieces began to connect. His distance, his avoidance, the sudden decision to disappear. This was not just about refusing to help me. He was hiding. I slowly closed the application and set the phone down beside me. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that allows thoughts to echo without interruption. I leaned back slightly, staring at nothing in particular, and let the weight of it all settle into something solid. This was no longer about doubt. It was about truth. And I knew, with a clarity I had never felt before, that I would not walk away from it. If you feel the story just took a darker turn than expected, comment number 4 below to keep going with me. Now let's step into the confrontation. I did not sleep much that night in the hotel, not because I was restless, but because something inside me had settled into a quiet, immovable certainty. The shock was gone. The confusion had faded. What remained was clarity, and it guided me the moment I opened my eyes the next morning. I was not going back to Maine. Not yet. I spent the early hours gathering what little information I had. Old emails, a previous address that Daniel had mentioned in passing, fragments of details that once seemed unimportant. When I combined them with what I had discovered in my financial records, a direction began to form. It led me south, toward a part of New Jersey I had never imagined I would visit. The building was nothing like the place Daniel had lived in Boston. It was older, worn by time and neglect. The paint on the exterior had faded unevenly, and the stairwell smelled faintly of dampness. It was not dangerous, but it carried the quiet exhaustion of a place people passed through rather than settled into. I stood outside for a moment, observing. Windows with drawn curtains, a few scattered sounds from inside, the low hum of ordinary life. This was where he had chosen to go, or perhaps where he had been forced to go. Either way, it was a sharp contrast to the life he had presented to me before. I walked up the stairs slowly and found the apartment number I had been given. My hand rested on the door for a second before I knocked. The sound echoed more loudly than I expected. There was movement inside, faint, hurried, then silence. I knocked again, firmer this time. Footsteps approached. The door opened just a few inches before stopping against the chain. Daniel stood there, his face partially visible through the gap. He looked different. Not older exactly, but worn. His eyes avoided mine at first, as if meeting them required more effort than he was prepared to give. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then the chain slid free, and the door opened wider. Emily appeared behind him almost immediately, her posture rigid, her expression guarded. She positioned herself slightly to his side, close enough to be part of the conversation, but far enough to suggest distance. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated what had happened. I reminded him that he had agreed to help me, that I had arrived as we discussed, and that he had disappeared without a word. My tone was calm, almost detached, but every word was deliberate. Emily responded first. Her voice was steady, controlled, but carried an edge that was impossible to ignore. She spoke about financial limitations, about survival, about how they could not take on additional responsibility. She described me not as a mother in need, but as a complication they could not afford. I listened without interrupting. Then I looked at Daniel. He remained quiet for several seconds, his gaze shifting between the floor and the space just beyond my shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, uncertain. He said they could not help me, that it was not possible, that things were already difficult. There was no denial, no defense, just agreement. I asked him to say it clearly, not for me, but for himself. To look at me and say that he was choosing not to help. When he did, it was barely above a whisper, but it was enough. Something inside me gave way in that moment, though it did not show on the surface. There were no raised voices, no tears, no visible collapse. Only a quiet understanding that settled into place with absolute finality. Emily stepped forward slightly, her presence signaling that the conversation was over. Daniel did not stop her. The door closed. The sound was soft, but it carried more weight than anything that had been said. I stood in the hallway for a few seconds longer, not because I expected it to open again, but because I needed to feel the stillness of that moment completely. This was not rejection in a single instant. This was the end of something that had been fading for a long time. And now, there was nothing left to misunderstand. I walked out of that building without looking back. The air outside felt different, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. My steps were slow but steady, each one carrying me farther from something I had spent years trying to preserve. I did not cry, not because I did not feel the loss, but because the pain had already settled into something deeper than tears could reach. What happened in that apartment was not sudden. It was not a single moment of failure. It was the result of years of distance, of choices made quietly and repeatedly until they became permanent. I had been holding on to a version of my son that no longer existed, and in that hallway, I finally let go. Over the next few days, I stayed alone. I returned to the hotel, kept my routine simple, and allowed myself the space to think without interruption. I did not call Daniel again. I did not expect him to reach out either, but on the third day, my phone lit up with his name. The message was brief. He said he needed to talk, that it was important, that things had changed. I read it more than once, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to be sure of my own reaction. A part of me felt the familiar pull to respond immediately, to step back into the role I had always played, but that part no longer had control. I agreed to meet him. We chose a public park not far from the city, a place where neither of us held any advantage. When I arrived, I sat on a bench near a quiet path and waited. When Daniel approached, I saw the difference immediately. He looked tired, his posture slightly bent, his movements uncertain. There was a tension in him that had not been there before. He spoke first, explaining that things had fallen apart. His job was unstable, his finances were worse than I had imagined, and his relationship with Emily was no longer steady. He said he had made mistakes, that he saw things differently now, that he needed help. His words were careful, shaped to sound like reflection, but there was urgency beneath them. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I took a moment before responding. Then I told him the truth. I told him I had never lost my money, that there had been no failed investment, no financial collapse. I told him about the inheritance, about the amount, about the decision I had made to test him. I explained it simply, without anger, without accusation, just facts. The change in his expression was immediate. Shock came first, followed by something else, something sharper, more focused. He asked questions, but not the ones I had expected. There was no apology, no pause to reflect on what had happened between us. Instead, his attention shifted to what the money could solve. He spoke about his debts, about the loan, about how everything could be fixed if I helped him now. In that moment, everything became clear. This was not regret. This was need. I looked at him, really looked, and understood that the choice in front of me was no longer about him. It was about me, about whether I would continue to give without boundaries or finally choose something different. I told him no, not harshly, not loudly, but firmly. I told him that I would not solve the problems he had created, especially not the ones built on deception. I told him that I needed distance, and that if there was ever going to be a relationship between us again, it would have to be built on something real. Then I stood up. I did not wait for his response. I did not need to hear it. As I walked away, I felt something I had not expected, not relief, but freedom. If that decision surprised you or made you rethink everything, comment number 6 below to continue with me. Now let's move into chapter 7 and see the consequences unfold. I did not look back after leaving the park. The path stretched ahead of me, lined with trees that moved gently in the afternoon wind. People passed by, some alone, some in pairs, each of them absorbed in their own lives. I walked through it all with a calm I did not recognize at first. It was not peace, not yet. It was something quieter, something steadier. For the first time in a long while, I was not reacting. I was choosing. The ride back to the hotel felt shorter than the one before. I sat by the window, watching the city shift from motion to stillness as the distance grew between me and that conversation. There was no part of me that questioned what I had said. No hesitation, no lingering urge to turn around and fix things. That surprised me more than anything else. For most of my life, my instinct had been to protect Daniel, to soften consequences before they reached him, to absorb what I could so he would not have to. But something had changed. Not suddenly, not in a single moment, but enough that I could finally see the pattern clearly, and I could step out of it. Back in my room, I sat at the small desk and opened my phone again, this time not to search for him, but to begin something else. I contacted a lawyer the next morning. The call was direct, practical, and focused on facts. I explained what I had found in my financial records, the unfamiliar loan, the forged signature, the missing funds. There was a pause on the other end before the lawyer responded, not with shock, but with careful clarity. What had happened was not just a personal betrayal. It was fraud. He explained the implications in measured terms. The loan, taken under my name, made me legally responsible unless proven otherwise. The forged signature could shift that responsibility, but only through formal investigation. There would be documentation, timelines, evidence. It would not be simple, and it would not be quick. I listened without interrupting. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, absorbing the weight of it. This was no longer something that existed only between a mother and her son. It had moved into a different space, one defined by law, accountability, and consequences that could not be undone by apologies. I did not feel anger in the way I might have expected. What I felt was clarity, a clean, unfiltered understanding of what needed to happen next. I agreed to move forward with the investigation. In the days that followed, I provided documents, signed forms, and answered questions. Each step felt deliberate, grounded in something that had been missing before. I was no longer trying to protect Daniel from the outcome of his choices. I was allowing those outcomes to exist. I did not contact him. I did not check for messages. I did not ask anyone about him. Whatever was happening in his life now, whatever pressure he was facing, it was his to carry, not mine. At night, when the room grew quiet, I sometimes thought about him, not as the man I had seen in the park, but as the child he once was, the boy who needed me for everything, the boy I had built my life around. Those memories did not disappear, but they no longer defined my decisions. They became something else, something I could hold without being controlled by. A few days later, my lawyer called again. The tone was steady, professional, but firm. The case was clear. The evidence pointed directly to deliberate action. There was a path forward, and it was strong. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a moment, letting the finality of it settle. For the first time in my life, I was not trying to shield my son from what he had done. And in that realization, something inside me became unshakably still. I did not return to Maine right away. The idea of going back to the same house, the same routines, the same quiet spaces filled with old memories no longer felt right. Something in me had shifted too deeply for that life to fit the same way again. I needed distance, not just from Daniel, but from the version of myself that had been defined entirely by him. So I began looking elsewhere. Vermont was not a place I had planned to live, but when I arrived, it felt calm in a way that was different from Maine. The air was softer, the pace slower, the landscape filled with rolling hills and still water. I found a small house near a lake, modest but full of light. Large windows faced the water, and there was a narrow path that led down to the shore. It was not extravagant. It did not need to be. It felt like a place where something new could begin. The process of settling in was quiet and deliberate. I bought only what I needed at first: a table, a bed, a chair by the window. Each choice felt intentional, as if I were building something carefully rather than filling space out of habit. My days began to take shape in ways that no longer revolved around waiting for a call or wondering if I mattered to someone else. I walked along the lake in the mornings, watching the surface shift with the light. I cooked for myself without distraction, noticing small things I had overlooked for years. I read more. I allowed silence to exist without trying to fill it. At first, it felt unfamiliar. Then slowly, it felt like mine. I began speaking to people in small, simple ways. A neighbor who passed by during my walks. A woman at a local market who remembered my face after the second visit. These were not deep connections, but they were real, and they did not carry the weight of expectation. They existed as they were, uncomplicated. One afternoon, I noticed a flyer at the community center for an art class. It was something I had never done before, something I would have once dismissed as unnecessary. But I signed up anyway. The first session was uncomfortable. My hands were unsure, my lines uneven, my colors uncertain. I felt older than everyone else in the room, slower to understand, slower to adapt. But I stayed. Week after week, I returned. Not because I was good at it, but because it gave me something I had not felt in a long time. A sense of creation that belonged only to me. As the days passed, I began to think about the inheritance in a different way. It was no longer just a resource for comfort or security. It carried the potential to change something beyond my own life. Through a local organization, I learned about women who had been placed in situations similar to mine. Older, often alone, financially exploited by people they trusted. The stories stayed with me. I met some of them in person. I listened as they described what had been taken from them, not just money, but dignity, trust, and stability. Their experiences mirrored parts of my own, but many of them had far fewer options than I did. That realization led to a decision. I worked with my lawyer to establish a fund dedicated to supporting women over 60 who had been financially abused. It was structured carefully, designed to provide both immediate assistance and long-term support. It was not about fixing everything. It was about offering something real where there had been loss. The first time I saw that support reach someone directly, I felt something shift inside me again. Not in the way it had before, not through pain or realization, but through purpose. One evening, I sat by the window in my new home, watching the lake settle into stillness as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The house was quiet, but it was not empty. For the first time, my life was not defined by who needed me. It was defined by who I chose to be. If you feel something has shifted deeply in this journey, comment number 8 below to stay until the end. Now let's move into the final outcome of this story. Time moved quietly in Vermont, almost without notice. The days passed in a steady rhythm, marked by small routines that had slowly become my own. The lake changed with the light. The air carried the scent of early autumn, and for the first time in years, I did not measure time by whether my phone would ring. Weeks turned into months. I heard about Daniel not through him, but through updates connected to the legal process. My lawyer kept me informed in simple, factual terms. His financial situation had worsened. The debt tied to the fraudulent loan had become impossible for him to manage. There were additional complications, details that suggested his situation was no longer temporary. Emily had left. That part did not surprise me as much as I expected it to. Their relationship had always felt unstable beneath the surface. Without financial stability, whatever held them together seemed to fall apart quickly. Daniel was now on his own, facing the consequences of decisions that could no longer be avoided. I listened to these updates without interruption. I asked only what I needed to understand the situation clearly. I did not offer help. I did not ask to speak with him. It was not indifference. It was distance, intentional and necessary. One afternoon, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. The handwriting was familiar the moment I saw it. I brought it inside, set it on the table, and waited a long time before opening it. The letter inside was simple, written carefully, without excess. Daniel admitted what he had done. He did not try to explain it away or shift responsibility. He wrote about the choices he had made, about how he had avoided facing them until there was no way left to escape. He acknowledged the years I had given him, the things he had once dismissed or misunderstood. What struck me most was what was not in the letter. There was no request, no mention of money, no attempt to fix anything immediately. I read it slowly, more than once, letting each word settle without rushing to interpret it. There was sincerity there, or at least something that resembled it closely enough to matter. But sincerity alone did not erase what had already happened. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I did not respond, not because I felt nothing, but because I felt too much to answer without certainty. The letter remained in the drawer for weeks, untouched but never forgotten. I knew it was there each time I passed the desk, but I did not feel the urgency to open it again. Its presence was enough. It represented something unresolved, but not something that controlled me anymore. Life in Vermont continued in a way that felt steady and intentional. My days were no longer shaped by waiting or wondering. I woke up each morning with a sense of quiet direction. The lake outside my window reflected the changing seasons, and with it, I began to notice how much I had changed as well. I often thought about the path that had brought me here, the years of sacrifice, the quiet loneliness, the doubt that had grown slowly over time. I no longer viewed those years with regret. They were part of me, but they did not define me anymore. I had given what I believed was right at the time. What I had not understood was the importance of limits. Daniel was still my son. That truth did not disappear, no matter what had happened between us. But the meaning of that relationship had changed. It was no longer built on unconditional giving or silent acceptance. If anything were to grow again between us, it would have to come from something stronger, something honest. I did not know if that would happen, and for the first time I was at peace with not knowing. I continued my classes, my work with the foundation, my walks along the water. These were not distractions. They were choices. They were pieces of a life I had built for myself, one that existed independently of anyone else's expectations. One evening, as the sun lowered over the lake and the light softened across the water, I sat by the window and allowed myself a moment of stillness. I had not lost everything. I had found something I did not know I needed: myself. In the end, life has a quiet way of revealing truths we once tried to avoid. Love, when given without boundaries, can slowly turn into something unbalanced, something that asks more than it returns. And sometimes it takes loss, not of things, but of illusions, to finally see clearly. What truly matters is not how much we give, but whether we remember to exist within our own lives while giving. Strength is not always loud. Often, it is the silent decision to walk away, to rebuild, and to choose self-worth over familiarity. Healing does not come from forgetting, but from understanding and moving forward with clarity. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own journey. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for sharing this space. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories like this.